Hi, my name is Martin Purnell and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity. This episode is extra special as it pays tribute to the entrepreneur and titan within the UK Christian media, Peter Meadows. Peter sadly passed away on Friday, 9th of January 2026, aged 84. Peter was the founder behind many of the UK Church's most loved ministries, including Buzz, later Premier Christianity, Spring Harvest and Premier Christian Radio. Paying tribute in this episode are the Reverend Cindy Kent, Graham Kendrick, Noel Richards, Michael Harvey, Joseph Steinberg, Rob Parsons, Dave Pope, Zana Stewart, Jeff Lucas and Steve Chalk. Peter was a guest in episode 62 of OGC. My co-presenter for this tribute to Peter is a previous guest as well, check out episode 72, and who recently wrote the obituary which was published in Premier Christianity, and that is Steve Goddard. Steve, you worked alongside him for decades. For those who are not really aware of how important Peter was to the birth and growing pains of modern-day Christian media, where should we start in his career?
I think you have to look at the situation that Peter came into as a new Christian. He was saved in the late 60s, the mid to late 60s. And this is the point when the church was still looking back wistfully to the time when clergymen ruled the earth. I mean, this was where pop music, creative arts, just didn't have a place in the average church context. You have to understand Cliff Richard almost. There's a classic case of this. When Cliff Richard was converted in the mid-60s, he was expected to give up music and become a teacher. I mean, because there was no way he should stay in the arts. So you have this context where Peter Meadows came in as a new Christian, full of creative ideas. And the collision course was underway, because Peter would always be looking at new ways to explain and communicate the gospel. He was a pioneer and a subversive one, really. I would see him as a rebel with a cause, somebody who was going against the perceived thinking and perceptions of the time. He loved the challenge of interpreting and presenting the Christian message with power through the prism of contemporary media.
And to share more, here's the Reverend Cindy Kent. What do you remember about meeting Peter for the first time, Cindy?
I think probably enthusiasm and wishing I could can it or, put it in a bag and take it away with me, because that was the one thing about him, wasn't he? He had an infectious enthusiasm for whatever he was involved with. I can't exactly remember what year it was, sometime in the 60s, back in the days when I was with the Settlers and together with Cliff, that's Cliff Richard, we did a load of concerts to raise money for Tear Fund. Incidentally, the name Tear Fund was coined by one Peter Meadows, the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund. But what a great way of talking about it as a tear fund. It's just brilliant.
Yeah.
And so we did a load of concerts to raise money and awareness. I can't remember what role Peter had to play in it, but he was definitely around at that particular time. And we were all aware of the magazine. Was it Buzz or was it called something else at that point? I can't remember. Peter seemed to have so many fingers in so many pies. And that's the one thing I loved about him, really, was the fact he had an enthusiasm for whatever it was he was involved in. And so that's where we first met. And it may well have been Manchester. Our paths crossed at various points in the intervening years. And then, of course, the next time I really caught up with him was actually Premier Radio.
Yes. How did you get involved with Premier Radio and what do you remember of that time working alongside Peter?
Well, it was a radio station I was determined not to get involved with because it was a Christian radio station and I didn't like the sound of it. And I was involved in commercial radio with Capital Radio I was working for. And the idea of a Christian radio station did not turn me on at all. But a guy called Mark Seaman, who was the very first programme director, he asked me if I'd like a job at Premier, well, it wasn't called Premier at that stage, if I'd like to come on board as a presenter with this Christian radio station. And of course, Peter was very much involved in that. And our paths just kept crossing like they do. It's weird, isn't it? Some people just come in and out of your life at various points. And then he got in touch with me sort of out of the blue to see if I'd be his plus one at an evening where he was getting an award for a company called Step Forward. And they were presenting him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I was very honoured to be asked to go along with him. And it was a fantastic evening. And so my abiding memory of him really is not when I last saw him in a hospital bed, but on that stage, just acknowledging the fact that people had thought so much of what he'd done in his life to give him that award. And he was incredibly humble the way he put it over, but you could see he was obviously chuffed to bits. And then the last time I saw him was actually in the hospital, and we were able to pray together, and that was lovely. I really appreciated that time together, and I think he did too.
As far as the number of years that have spanned where you've come in and out of each other's lives, how would you sum up Peter, and what would you like to say would be his legacy?
When Peter started up Premier Radio, along with several other people, it almost came to an end within a few months of actually starting up for various reasons. And Peter was obviously very disappointed, but somebody came up with a phrase then, which I thought was really good. And that was that architects don't always live in the houses they build. And I thought that probably sums up Peter. You know, he comes up with ideas. That was his gift. It wasn't running it. It wasn't being a CEO. It wasn't being whatever. His wonderful gift from God, I think, was the imagination to come up with these ideas, like we've mentioned, Tier Fund and all the other things. But the idea of running a Christian radio station, it wasn't his job. It wasn't his forte, really, to run a station like that. That's not where his skills lay. And so that's how I'd sort of think of him, as somebody who's an architect, but not living in the house he's designed. My abiding memory, as I say, of him is just being full of enthusiasm for whatever it was he was doing at the time, just absolutely enjoying life. And he and Rosie made a wonderful couple. I've been to several parties with them and just seeing the two of them together. If ever two people were meant to be together, it was them. And they've got a lovely family, and he's left a wonderful legacy with them. But he's left a legacy with the rest of us who just caught a little bit of that wonderful stardust that he carried around with him and sprinkled on the rest of us along the way.
And of course, the story goes that he met Rosie at a certain Settlers gig in Manchester in the 60s.
It's nice that I had a little part to play in what was an abiding, wonderful marriage. And I just think it's great that they're reunited now. I think that's just absolutely brilliant. And he was so ready to go. I mean, the last time I saw him, he didn't actually say, "I want to die," but you could tell he'd made his peace with God, and he was just looking forward to seeing Rosie again. And heaven's gain is our loss.
Well, Steve, I like the expression of sprinkling stardust over people from Cindy, as other contributors will attest. What do you remember of the early days when working alongside Peter?
Well, I came into the situation having sent an article to Buzz magazine on spec. I'd been a musician at the time. I'd recorded an album with Kingsway Music, which was part of MGO, Musical Gospel Outreach. And I was fairly critical of the Christian music scene at the time. And I was so frustrated with it that I sent this article off to Buzz, thinking there's no way they'll publish this. And 2 days later, Peter calls me and says, "Do you want a job?" And that was how my life changed in that phone call. And what was nice about it was he just threw me in to the mix. It was a question of saying, see what you can do with the sort of discipline that comes from learning journalism. He saw a natural talent in me. I didn't even see it myself, frankly, at the time, but he could see something in me. And almost like his own experience at the ad agency where he first began as a teenager, they threw him in there and he was learning all the time through just being involved and watching the creative process. And he did the same to me. Threw me in there, said, "Let's see what you can do. Let's see if you can make it." And within 18 months, I became editor.
In later life, did he still use that old idea of just throwing you in and see what happens?
I think it's different in later life because he knows what you can do. Then it's a question of steel on steel. From that point on, you're almost verbally jousting with each other in a meeting. That's what I loved about him. He loved people who would confront him and who would come up with an idea quicker than him. But he didn't like people who were slow, off the mark. He didn't have time for people who were just simply kind of just idling. You had to be on your mettle in meetings. You had to try and get ahead of him before you walked through the door. As I've said in my obituary, if you couldn't stand the heat in the kitchen, best get out.
And with me is Graham Kendrick. How did you get involved and what were your first memories of Peter, please?
In my teens, because I'm about 9 years younger than Pete, but there was a whole era in the 60s where coffee bar evangelism, which focused on music, started to really spread across the UK evangelical churches. And I saw that model. I mean, like a lot of my generation, I was listening to the pop music of the day on Radio Caroline, pirate radio stations and so on, and loving the music and wanting to play it. So I guess in a way, here came along something that, as a Baptist, son of a Baptist pastor, which I am, here's a way you can actually play that kind of music, and still be a Christian.
Yes.
Perhaps that was an element in there. Anyway, in the context of that, we formed a little band and we started to get to play a few coffee bars here and there. My older sister, 3 years older than me, Gillian, she played in the band, but she was also the band secretary. So she was very good at connecting with people. And so it was this Buzz broadsheet, which was initially there to connect these bands, which has sprung up all over the country, which Pete Meadows was behind. And then he started to, along with Jeff Shern and Dave Payne and John Webb, they began to put together training things. You used to call them teach-ins because that was the cool kind of hippie, word for clinics and teach-ins and so on. And we got drawn into those to attend them, sometimes to take part in them. And they were doing tours as well, booking major venues and stuff. And I wasn't a singer in the band. I was a songwriter in our little band. We called the Forerunners, Fore.
Yeah.
So I was electric guitarist and I wrote the songs. I wasn't the lead singer. And I got this call from MGO, Musical Gospel Outreach, with those 4 guys were running. They're looking for a guitarist for one of the tours. I was a student by that time at Teacher Training College. So I went on that tour as a guitarist, which was actually a bit difficult because they put music in front of me and I don't read music, only chord charts. And the music director was kind of expecting, those assumptions we made.
Wow.
I was at that time as a student, I'd switched from a band because the band broke up when everyone went their separate ways. I was writing because songwriting was my passion. So I'd become a kind of singer-songwriter and I was writing. I just had a handful of songs. And on the tour bus, long journeys, sometimes people sing songs or they'd sing their songs, and I got to sing a few of my little singer-songwriter songs. And obviously Pete and Jeff and the others clocked the fact that something was going on there with my writing. They had the Westminster Central Hall booked for something and an American band had dropped out. They had visa problems or something. So they had to fill a gap in the program. So they put me up there for 15 minutes. I just about had enough songs for 15 minutes. But it went down really well. And they followed that up with, will you do an album? So I did an LP record with them. So it was those tours really that got me involved. And in the midst of those tours, one of them was It's Buzz. I think we were just about to record the album. But they'd invited me on that tour as an artist in my own right. And believe it or not, I found the script for the It's Buzz tour.
Oh, wow.
I have the script. I've been looking it through, I've forgotten a lot of what happened, but it's like a masterclass in communication. All the elements are there that you can see. And it's Pete's conception. He's put this thing together. And I guess in a sense, today, it wouldn't be that surprising, a program like that, but it was very radical in those days because the church had not caught up with the communications revolution in TV, particularly, and were really bad at communicating stuff. And along comes Pete, with his background in marketing and so on, and put together this really interesting program, which took people from A to B. There's a brass section. That was a bit unusual, sort of punctuating the program in various ways, with fanfares and stuff. There's a folk band, a rock band, a singer-songwriter. That was me. Pete even did his own comedy song.
Really?
Froggy Went A-Courting, I think it was. He was the anchor man. That was a bit different as well. They had a news desk on stage. And of course, TV news was a relatively new thing still. Radio news, yes. He had a news desk up there. A piece of drama, with some actors. There were some dancers. That was shocking, because this was church. Sometimes a youth leader would take a whole row of his youth group out in protest at some of these things. There was just this idea that if it was Christian, because it wasn't church, we weren't trying to do a church service, but because it was, a Christian event, people couldn't quite cope sometimes. So yeah, it was radical. That was Pete. That's what he did, right up the cutting edge.
So if we look back on his life, obviously there must have been frustration at times. What do you remember from Peter and what have you learnt from him?
I wouldn't have known that much of the background because there's a bit of an age gap and that whole world of running, because they started a record company, they were doing tours, but they had this kind of can-do attitude. Honestly, they didn't really know what they were doing. They were publishing songs. They didn't really know anything about copyright, but they learnt, So I think there was a certain amount of pain in pushing forward into things that you don't really know about.
Yes.
But they had this determination. So come on, it can't be that difficult. We can do it. There was always a financial difficulty. I can remember a time when I think financially, I think it might have been the time when they split MGO into the magazine and the record company and something else maybe. And they really almost went down the tube, financially. They were really, really struggling. But they had that kind of, we're just going to do this, Yes. Yeah, there was pain on the way. And I think relationally, at times, you were aware from a distance that there were tensions within, but they got through them. And out of it, actually, came some very, very successful and creative things. The music part split off, and Jeff Schoen took that and he joined Kingsway Publications, which was just a book publication, and sort of collaborated with them in what became Kingsway Music, and which began to publish the new worship songs which were coming out of the church, which were just on the grapevine really for a number of years and needed a publisher. I think there is that sense of sort of faith and trust that something's happening which is bigger than us, and we're just going to press on and get through.
So someone who was at the It's Buzz tour was a young teenager from Llantrisant in South Wales, young Noel Richards. What do you remember of the It's Buzz tour, and also Pete singing A Froggy Goes A-Courting, apparently?
I don't remember him singing, but I do remember the event. And I can actually see where I was sitting. I can still remember where I was sitting, looking down at the stage. Peter on my right would be his stage left. He was the compere of this event. I'd never been to anything like it in my life. Growing up in quite a narrow Pentecostal background, we didn't go to theatres, we didn't go to concerts. But our pastor at the time, a great guy called John Glass, who was a mentor to me and got me started on all this, he took us as a youth group to the Colston Hall. I'd never been in anything like it. It was like a rock concert, flashing lights. And then Graham Kendrick on the stage, just guitar and voice. Can't remember what he sang, but I remember looking at Graham and thinking, that's what I want to do. Graham modeled something for me that planted a dream in my heart. And I think when you organize events, as Pete did over many years, you never know what the consequence of those actions are. And I think Pete organizing that tour, a very important time for Christian music in the UK. It was the birth of something fresh and new, musical gospel outreach. I used to get these albums sent to me in the post. It was just incredible. And to see somebody on the stage with a guitar modeling something, and I thought, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to be. And so a dream was planted in my heart at that point. And I remember many years later, I think it was 1996, I was doing a tour of the UK with my band, and we actually played at the Colston Hall. And I went and sat in the same area where I was sitting as a 16-year-old and just sat there and gave thanks to God for that pivotal moment in my life all those years ago when I was 16, which changed my life. And I never imagined what we were going to do. I never imagined things like Wembley Arena, Wembley Stadium. So I'm grateful to people like Pete who pioneered and broke something, created something new in the UK, which has had incredible effect in my life. And I'm sure in the lives of so many other people.
Frustration obviously plays a part, I would have thought, from time to time. What can you remember about frustration that you would have seen from Pete and how he coped?
With somebody like Pete, they do things. They have a vision for something. They say, right, let's do this. And there are times when you get setbacks. Something goes wrong. And I think the mark of a true entrepreneur is he or she goes, well, that didn't work. Let's move on to something else. I've got a friend who's a very good businessman. He's an entrepreneur. And he's always looking for ideas. He tries ideas. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, okay, we'll draw a line under that and go on to something else. And I think people like Pete, they birthed so many different things, had his fingers in so many pies, if you like. Reading about Premier Christianity, It's Buzz, Spring Harvest, all these things. And I think he was a visionary. And there are times of frustration when things don't go as we expect, but we just keep pressing on. Because that's what we do. We have no choice. We have to keep going forward. And I'm sure there's so many people who are listening to this who are grateful for people like Pete, who's pushed forward through frustration and got on with doing things.
In a few years' time, when people listen to this again, what do you think would be his legacy?
It's really hard to quantify at this point in time. I mean, so much of what's going on in the UK today in terms of Christian music, the arts, what's happening with Christian radio, that's all down to people like Pete. And so I think we have an awful lot to be grateful for these pioneers who have been criticized, but have been, no, we've seen something, we're going for it. We're going to do this because God's put this thing in our heart, and sink or swim, we're going to do it. So I think the legacy is all the countless singer-songwriters, people who are involved in Christian broadcasting, the people, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, who have gone to Spring Harvest over the years, whose lives have been impacted. I guess if I hadn't gone to that event in Bristol, my life would be totally different. And I think what happens is there's these times when things coincide. Pete had this vision for musical gospel outreach, developing Christian music, creating a platform for budding Christian artists. I happened to go along to that. First time I'd ever been to a Christian concert. And that changed my life. And there are these moments when, I guess, God causes coincidences. He's the coordinator of incidences. And for me, without its buzz, without a visionary like Pete, would I be doing what I'm doing today? Would I have done what I have done? So I think we all have a part to play in our lives, and we don't know what effect that is having. But there is this ripple effect. And I think Pete doing what he did created a ripple effect that has touched so many countless lives. What a legacy. Incredible.
Steve, how would you sum up these early years then of Peter's career, including MGO, musical gospel outreach?
Again, he loved the challenge of interpreting and presenting the Christian message with power in that new context. MGO, I don't think people understand how dynamic and how original and how threatening musical gospel outreach was. As I mentioned earlier, Cliff's conversion.
Yeah.
This was a big, big change, and he should have become a teacher. Musical gospel outreach gave permission to a whole new culture, new generation of people, that they could interpret their faith within creative arts that were presented in popular creative arts and popular culture. This was an entirely new way of thinking, and that was his important contribution through MGO.
We now move into the Spring Harvest era, if that's okay, Steve. What do you remember about Peter and his plans for what became Spring Harvest?
Well, I hardly knew Peter before Spring Harvest began, and it was at Spring Harvest that we got to know each other. Let me explain that Spring Harvest, that first day of Spring Harvest in 1979, it was nothing like it is today, because Spring Harvest, nobody knew what was going to happen. It was anything could happen in the next half hour. That was how exciting Spring Harvest was. He used an advert. I remember his advert that went out in Buzz, 6 unbelievable days for as little as £17. That was the great big message that went out. And it was 6 unbelievable days in a very cold, damp North Wales chalet. But let me tell you, that first night of Spring Harvest, when everybody congregated in the big main hall, this was not a sit down in rows waiting for things to begin. People were arriving in fancy dress. There were klaxons going off. There were no seats that I remember. This was sort of like a gig. The idea of everybody just coming and saying, well, what's going to happen next? And that was what was so exciting about it, because Peter loved a gig. You have to understand, in his mentality, it was bringing people together and the energy and the dynamic of a group, but not necessarily it being ordered. And there was no ritual. No ritual had been established. The early days of Spring Harvest were unbelievably exciting.
Well, to share more about Peter and how Spring Harvest came into being, here is gospel artist, founder of Salt Mine Trust and a co-founder of Spring Harvest, Dave Pope.
Peter Meadows was endued with an amazing gift of creativity. He was interested in the music that I was involved in, as well as the ministry. And when Peter had the opportunity of going to Pontin's Tower Beach holiday camp in the 70s, I think it was for a Methodist youth outreach, I remember him coming back and sharing with another mutual colleague, Clive Calver, about the possibility of perhaps doing something for the church in the UK, of bringing people together from all different persuasions and from different backgrounds, and bringing them together in a spirit of worship and teaching and equipping the church to be useful for such a time as it was at that time. Peter, with his creativity and his ideas, began to put forward how that might look and how it might work. I think he was very brave. That the church at that time was fairly well fragmented, diverse, but Peter recognized that there was a spark that could be ignited to actually change the course of church history. And I believe that Spring Harvest did that in promoting unity and renewed commitment to the faith and the follow-through of faith. And so I remember a meeting that he called with Clive, together with myself and together with another colleague, Colin Saunders, who was very much involved in Christian ministries and the support of Christian ministries through MGO, of which he was a director at that time. And we brainstormed and came up with the idea of Spring Harvest. During the development of Spring Harvest that just grew and grew and grew, it was Peter's creativity, ability to recognize appropriate opportunity to encourage a broader involvement from all areas of the church and all persuasions and all emphases. It was his creativity, along with his amazing gift of being a wordsmith extraordinaire. I mean, if you wanted something to be written well, Peter Meadows was your man. And if you wanted to visualize how something might look on a piece of paper and express it appropriately, Peter Meadows was your man. To have him as part, if you like, even one of the leading lights of taking this sudden movement forward, we were so blessed and just so enriched by what Peter's gifts brought to the table at that time. He was amazing.
What would you say about Peter's ways? If something goes wrong, he dusts himself off?
Yes, and Martin, things did go wrong, as they go wrong for all of us. You can have the most creative, intelligent person in the whole wide world, but things do go wrong. It's called life. Yeah. And in Peter's life experience, there were things that he would say went wrong. Peter did not suffer fools gladly. And once he had got an idea that he sensed that God had given him that idea, wild horses wouldn't drag him away from that idea. And in doing that, rightly, he would stick to his guns and he would maintain the potential of what he sensed God had given to him. Inevitably, there would be disagreements. And that would be part of Peter's experience. I've had many, many conversations, even around Spring Harvest and some of the development of Spring Harvest, where there would be people who would not necessarily agree with what Peter would say. The only thing that I would comment on is that I think Peter's track record and his ability to deliver what he said he would deliver was always maintained. If Peter said he would do something, he would do it. Totally trustworthy. He would never let you down. Totally dependable. Forthright in his opinions, yes. But he would always achieve the goal that he sensed that God had given to him. And for that, I will always have long-lasting admiration. There was a lovely fun side to Peter. And, you know, that was endorsed and enhanced by Rosie.
And you said he was a wordsmith. If we had to sum up him in a legacy, what would you say?
You don't need the Oxford English Dictionary when you had Peter Meadows around. I think of some of the titles that he came up with or that he fleshed out around the Spring Harvest themes. Who would have a theme of Spring Harvest? Deck chairs on the Titanic. Okay, it's a popular phrase, but to bring that into the area of Christian ministry, that's interesting. Where truth and justice meet. He had a way with words, but he wouldn't just leave it at a title. He would then expand on it, and he would explain what he meant by that. I think that there's a price to pay for Peter's promotion to glory, because we are the poorer in the skills that Peter brought into an expression of faith and the communication of what really is important as we develop ministry in the times in which we live. As he knew he was getting ready for promotion, he publishes 2 books. One is on the Gospel of John, which actually I've also been promoting in Flame Trust through our website. but also on retirement. He leaves with us a treasure chest of literature, of his writing, of his ministry that we can still refer to as we try to take on board many of the things that we learned from him and that we can continue to learn from what he wrote.
Steve, I want to nick a line from the obituary that you wrote because it was so good. You mentioned that his late wife, Rosie, suggested that his headstone should state, "Gone to another meeting." Dave just said that Peter could be forthright but have fun as well. What do you remember of Peter in meetings?
Peter was ahead of every meeting. Peter had already got an agenda in his head before he arrived, no matter what the agenda was within the meeting officially. Peter had agendas coming out of his ears. There were ideas that he'd been dreaming up in the car as he was arriving. I mean, he was that kind of character. The whole point was you had to compete with Peter in a meeting. Yes, you could argue with him. Yes, you could disagree with him, but he was always on the ball in a meeting. Sometimes you like to walk in and think he was ahead of you. I remember one time when I was editing Buzz, he came to me and said, hey, now listen, you need to do something on Spitting Image, because this was the big thing at the time. It had arrived in 1984, something like that. He said, I know the person who's behind it. He's a guy called Martin Purnell. He's a Christian, and he designed the Channel 4 logo, and he had the idea for Spitting Image while he was working on various other designs. And I said, hold it there, Pete. I know Martin. I've already done the interview. It goes into next month's edition. Oh, that was such a sweet moment. I'd beaten him. But he loved that. He was impressed. He couldn't be but impressed that we were ahead of the game. But in a way, with Peter, that's what I'm talking about, mental jousting. You had to be ahead of the game.
As we find out as well from other people, he likes to play on words. He was a wordsmith.
A complete wordsmith. He was unhappy with anything that didn't just feel right. I mentioned in my obituary, le mot juste, the right word, the exact word. I remember this wonderful phrase he came up with for the Evangelical Alliance. A world falling apart needs a people coming together. Was complete genius in my mind. And nobody would have got there except Peter. He constantly was looking for the right phrase, the right words, the right impact, always about impact.
Well, after stepping away from Premier Radio, London's very first licensed radio station, as far as the UK government was concerned, which he had set up, of course, retirement could have been his future career. What do you remember, Steve, about Peter at this time and what he was going to do next?
Peter realised that he had these skills that could be translated across a number of organisations. And so he took those skills to hone and sharpen the messages of various organisations out there, including World Vision. And I worked with him on projects there, also the Bible Society and others. He had this ability to see what the real need was, also to provoke potential donors to give. It's not just a question of spreading information. It's about knowing what information creates a response. He was very, very good at that, and great to work alongside in that respect.
One person that Peter started to mentor was Michael Harvey, the founder of the UK schools project God and the Big Bang, plus developer of Back to Church Sunday. Michael, how did you first meet Peter?
I was doing a workshop on a culture of invitation for the Diocese of Guildford. And I looked out into the audience and I could not believe my eyes that there in the middle of the audience was this familiar figure, which of course was Peter. And I couldn't believe that Peter Meadows had actually turned up to a workshop that I was doing. He was like this kind of a hero of mine. You know, in my 20s, I saw Peter, who basically kind of was doing all sorts of incredible work for Christianity. And he actually turned up to one of my workshops. And so in the break, I approached him and said, would it be possible after the workshop to have some time with him? And he was so gracious, you know, that he allowed time. And that was around about 10 years ago. And he has given me so much of his time ever since, Martin.
Wonderful. And what was the workshop?
It was about developing a culture of invitation, which is kind of a development on from the work that I did 20 years ago on Back to Church Sunday. And so I've just really been trying to get invitation into the life of the church ever since.
So that was 10 years ago. And how important has he been in your life?
Well, if you can imagine, Peter had so much to offer in the area of marketing and messaging. And he really kind of took what I was doing and he started to kind of shape it. And he started to take, some of the good stuff that I'd already developed and made it much better. And so along with Steve Goddard and Peter and myself, we launched a national weekend of invitation. And I remember us kind of in London with major church leaders offering this concept to Christianity today. And that was just one of his ideas. But he also kind of then enabled me to take some of the things like the Acorn spiritual practice, which is an evangelism spiritual practice. And he helped me hone that and then start to take that to different countries around the world, Martin.
What else can you remember from Peter and what he did for you?
Well, again, he was so generous with his time. Always had a little agenda as well about him. And his generosity kind of led him to say, hey, listen, we've got this kind of place in Spain, a place called Torre. For mates rates, you and your wife can basically have that place. Oh, I was just so delighted. And then the little kind of additional thing was, as long as you preach at the local church. Now, this was not an imposition on me whatsoever. In fact, the local church, Tory Evangelical Church, has become very, very precious to me. But his generosity, was just utterly kind of stunning, really, for somebody who could have just retired and lived a nice, easy life. He was always out to help, Martin.
And as far as his legacy is concerned, in 10 years' time, we look back, what do you think his legacy would be?
I can only kind of talk about his legacy through the work that we were doing. I have to say, it was a blow that he has died too soon, kind of for me. However, his final words to me were, bless you, Michael. I'm having a little burst of energy. I wanted to say thanks and well done. The resource that has been created will help Christians throughout the world live out the will of God. I intend to take those words and the resource that we created together to as many places and to as many countries as I possibly can. And as I do that, I will be taking a part of Peter kind of with me. That's his legacy, that his work will continue, because his work was really answering the call of God to actually kind of extend the kingdom of God in his generation. And so I want to continue in that small way that work that we did together.
And to share more about Peter on how he was able to make time to mentor others, here is ordained Anglican priest and CEO of International Mission to Jewish People, Joseph Steinberg.
Peter was a huge person in my life and a great mentor, a wonderful friend. I don't think that I would be where I am today if it wasn't for Peter, honestly. When I met Peter, I was a curate in a church in Chigwell. It was about 1997, something like that. And I got struck with this idea about the year 2000. Remember all the doom and gloom about the year 2000 and computer resets?
Yeah.
And I came across this ancient symbol for God that looked like the letter Y. And I ended up with this thing called Y2000 and the 5 Y pictures. And I was just burning with this sort of evangelistic desire to get this program out, to sort of get people to provoke a question through wearing this ancient Christian symbol of the Trinity. And then people saying, why are you wearing the Y? And then giving people these 5 Y images of Jesus, why he came, died, rose again, and how he changes our lives. It was a nobody and a no one, really. Somebody that I knew who was friends with Peter, and they said, this is a brilliant idea, and I'm going to put you in touch with this guy called Peter Meadows. I hadn't heard of Peter. I made the 2-hour drive to see Peter because he agreed to see me, and sat down and I shared it all with him, and the 5 Y pictures and the whole concept of Y2000 and all of that and all the ideas that I had. At the end of the meeting, he said, Joseph, I got people coming to me with ideas all the time. and they're all just crazy, out of this world, nutty ideas that will never work. He goes, but for all the times and all the people I've met, it's because I knew that one day I would meet somebody like you with a great idea like this. And I was flabbergasted that he even, I was like, really, but I didn't know Peter at all to know what a huge compliment that really was. And what ended up coming of that was we literally launched Y2000 at Spring Harvest. We flew with the Y stuff. I think 70,000 pins were worn for the year 2000. We had these little things that he helped develop with this company called Z Fold. It was an A4 sheet that folded down into a little card, and it opened up like a Z and then opened up again into a sheet. And it had all the pictures of the 5 Y pictures. Think of the 4 spiritual laws. This is the 5 Y pictures. And we had a website and all this stuff. And it was amazing. And then we partnered together with Agape to create the Y course. And that was sort of a pre-alpha course. On the first tranche of the Y course, over 4,000 churches used it. And the book that we wrote together called Beyond Belief, which then its second revision became the Book of Y, over 50,000 copies were sold. 50,000. I mean, that's huge. And so many people came to faith. Like, I was always bumping into people. Even still, I'd meet people who were like, I went on the Y course and came to faith, or I read the book and came to faith. And it was an extraordinary privilege and opportunity to with Peter. I would have never written a book, but Peter and I wrote this book together. Peter loves illustrations and analogies like I do as well. And the book was full of that. It was just a wonderful opportunity. And none of those things to develop me and grow me and to give me that confidence would have ever happened. I certainly wouldn't have ended up doing all the things that I've done if it wasn't for Peter. And I certainly wouldn't be in the role that I am now if it wasn't for Peter. And even when I was in my last job, I was the director of fundraising and marketing at Church Mission Society, CMS, and brought Peter on board to help us with our fundraising, writing our appeals. And he just had outstanding results. And then when I came here to this role 11 years ago, again, he helped us develop a strategy for doing appeals and to help me as we sought to grow our income for the mission that we're in now. He was just a man of extraordinary talent with a huge heart, full of love. He was a great mentor to me. I'll just always love him. I wrote to the prayer group for him that it's a great sadness, a great loss for us, but a wonderful joy in heaven right now, because that's what Peter was about. And I remember working on the Book of Y with him when we were working on the chapters about what is to come, just the exuberance, the great joy and expectation that we had together as we thought about the world to come.
What do you think in 10 years' time, looking back, will be his legacy?
Well, my prayer is that people will look at his willingness to open up the extraordinary natural gifts that God gave him and allow himself to be used for the kingdom and abused at times for the kingdom, and yet still press on willingly without any hesitation to enable hundreds of people like me to be able to open ourselves up to what God is doing in us. I really hope, if anything, he's an example to future people that God is always at work in just normal people. Peter's a very normal guy, extraordinarily talented, but so down to earth. He wasn't full of himself at all. He was very servant-hearted, taking a guy like me who was a nobody and listening to the vision that I felt God gave me and then helping me to run with it. And I hope that people will allow themselves to be used by the Lord in the same way that Peter allowed himself to be used and ultimately enabled other people to be used in the same way.
And with me now is the founder of Care for the Family, Rob Parsons. Rob, what do you remember of your first meeting with Peter?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't a meeting. I was about 19 or 20 years old. My parents didn't go to church, but at the corner of my street was a little Brethren assembly where I'd gone since I was 4 years old when I was a kid to Sunday school. And so that was my experience, that kind of Brethren background. But when I was 19 or 20, somebody took me to this thing. It was a kind of a concert. It was a conference, and it was outrageous. They had these bands there and incredible speakers. And on the stage was this guy called Peter Meadows. And he was up there with some other young lads. He didn't look much older than me, but he was obviously a mover and shaker. And I just sat at the back with my eyes wide open as I saw all this stuff. And I think that's one of my memories of Peter, that he was such a trailblazer. And he was just ready to have a crack at some new things and a new vision. So I didn't meet him till, in any real sense, till many years after that, probably when I began speaking at Spring Harvest, really, when I was about 40 years old. But no, that great memory of these guys at the front, pioneers. Pete was a pioneer. Yeah, I remember that well.
Looking at his career and your career, how often that you both were at the same time in the same room?
Not often. We tended to meet at Spring Harvest. It was lovely to see him there. And then with the early stages of Premier Radio, we would come across. I remember being with Peter on pretty well the first day of Premier Radio. And he was so proud of that. And what an incredible thing that's turned out to be. What another one of those pioneering ventures. So we didn't see a lot of each other, but we saw enough of each other to become friends. Diane, my wife, and Rosemary and Peter would get together occasionally, and certainly at birthdays and special times. And the kids got to know each other a little bit. So, yeah, it was a privilege, really.
What do you think would be Peter's legacy?
Well, I think it would be what I mentioned a moment ago. It was the legacy of the pioneer, whether it was those early concerts, the early years of Spring Harvest, the Christianity magazine, Premier Radio, and probably, you'll talk to other people. There's probably 25 things that is the real truth. This the legacy of this pioneer. And he was a wonderful mix, I think. He was a strong character, could be very strong, and he needed to be at times, and he would speak his mind. But there was a gentleness and a winsomeness about him as well. A lovely smile. I saw a tribute to him online from Christianity magazine, a lovely photograph of him with that lovely smile. But I think his legacy will be that pioneering thing. And it wasn't just good ideas. I mean, they came to fruition, for goodness sake, So we got a wonderful legacy, actually.
For every vision comes frustration. What can you remember from Peter?
These pioneers become so passionate about things, they can't understand why the whole world's not on board. I remember trying to get audiences behind Premier Radio and getting them to write to their MPs and saying, we need a Christian radio station. And why aren't people doing more? And that kind of thing. But it was never unkind. It was more that frustration, if there was a bit of it, of really wanting to get on with stuff and see things come about.
In his retirement years, he still didn't give up.
Yeah.
What can you remember of those times?
Yeah, well, the thing about Peter is that he had such a body of knowledge, a body of wisdom, a body of experience. I think people didn't let him retire, is the truth. Loads of people were asking him for advice and wisdom. I've just written a book now called A Knock at the Door, which has had quite a lot of exposure recently. But I sent the manuscript of that to Peter. And I remember sitting down with Peter in a room in London, and we went through it together, and he gave me his ideas and what he felt and what he thought. And lots of people did that with him. They realized that here was a treasure of wisdom and experience. And not just to ask his advice, but to actually, would you help us with this, Peter? Would you help us get that launch? And would you write this copy for us? And all that kind of stuff. So I don't think people really allowed him to retire. And probably in his heart, he was glad they didn't.
Steve, what do you think, looking back in 10 years' time, will be Peter's legacy?
Well, apart from those three significant creations that we've talked about, I think he gave people permission to use their creative gifts to make as much impact as possible. And also the permission to fail, because not everything that he did worked. The Premier Radio situation didn't work for him, in spite of it being a great dream. Mm-hmm. I think he was quite happy with failure if we learned from it. And it's the right way to be. And the idea was to learn and move on. Don't get stuck in regret. Some things will work, some things won't. And I believe that he gave permission to people to try things out. The great innovation of Buzz from the early days, looking at it now, you can't believe how old-fashioned and hackneyed, and how could anybody see this as radical? But he took that risk at that time and established a new sort of orthodoxy that then he would recreate. He would go on and push again the boundaries, push the envelope. So I think he gave permission to people to do that. And I think that will be a very important part of his legacy.
For me, when I was a sales training officer, I used to tell the story of how in America you were never a millionaire until you had gone bankrupt at least once. So you could prove that actually the second time around you had learnt from your mistakes. How applicable would that be, do you think, to Peter?
I think so. I do believe he probably made a mistake about Premier Radio in his plans for it, whether that could ever have been achieved. He had a massive heart, if you like, for evangelism, for reaching out into the community. I think that there was a failure there, but that out of that, he saw the future. He would put it behind him. Let's move on. Let's try something else. Let's make a success of something going forward.
And as a friend and a colleague as well, Steve, what did you learn yourself from Peter?
Don't settle. Be bold. Be inventive. Go with your instinct. I mean, take risks. Accept the criticism. And I learned from Peter about taking those risks.
And we have a podcast as well, all about risks. And how do you spell faith? R-I-S-K.
Correct.
So with me to discuss how much of a pioneer Peter was and the risks he took is the author of 34 books and counting, broadcaster, former Vice President of Evangelical Alliance UK, and former member of Spring Harvest Management Team, Jeff Lucas. Jeff, how much of a pioneer was Peter and the risks he took? What can you tell us, please?
You have to kind of go back to the landscape of the sort of late 70s and 80s, a time of great innovation in the church and horrendous fashions in the world. Peter was one of those guys. He thought out of the box, it's a phrase often used, but there was a possibility thinking that Peter had, whether it came to the very possibility that there could be a national Christian radio station in the UK. I remember back then, as a relatively new Christian, the thought of that was, well, that's just impossible. That can't happen. If I can put it crudely, he was not a faith airhead who just plucked ideas out of the sky and then just said, well, we're going to believe it, we're going to receive it, we're going to declare it, yada, yada. But rather, he was someone who said, okay, could we do this? What is it going to take? He had the ability to gather people around him to help facilitate the vision that he had. And then when you look at events like Spring Harvest, which for international listeners, Spring Harvest at its peak, 58 to 60,000 people gathering for a week of worship, teaching and celebration. In being the co-founder of that, Peter didn't just imagine a kind of Christian knees up where we could all run away and get away from the world and headbutt a few tambourines on an annual basis. Peter, rather, he wanted to really equip the church for action, which was the kind of the mission statement for Spring Harvest. And so Peter was asking questions like, how can the church be effective in a postmodern culture that's lost the ability to believe in a key story? He was asking questions like, is it the social gospel if we actually accompany our words with works that will turn hearts and heads to Jesus? And so Peter was unafraid of asking difficult questions and then had this dynamic imagination. And I think imagination, without being silly or weird, imagination is a key component of faith. To imagine what can be if you actually believe that you're walking with the God of the universe who threw the world and the universe into being. Peter had that kind of thinking. And it was a real privilege all those years ago to become his friend as well as a co-worker together with him.
Yeah, you mentioned international listeners. The worldwide listener might not understand exactly how little the Christian media was in the 70s and 80s. How important is the legacy of Peter, what he's left us and what he achieved?
He showed us, and I say this as a Brit, he showed us that we could say yes to possibility that we hadn't dreamed of. And I'm talking to you from Colorado in the USA. I think, for example, our American listeners and viewers might say, well, you know, what's the big deal, Christian radio? I don't think they would necessarily understand what a bleak landscape it was back then. Mm. And then there was Buzz magazine, which became Premier Christianity. And I've been privileged to write the back page for that for the last 29 years, which is kind of weird. I think there's a mistake on the birth certificate. But Peter said, let's do this. I also think his legacy, Martin, was that he invested in developing people. And I'm one of them. I owe a huge personal debt to him. He was a great friend. He navigated the bumps and bruises that anybody involved in Christian leadership at any level is invariably going to experience. I think at times he wasn't afraid to ask questions, but he never distilled into a kind of cynicism that would be paralyzing. But he navigated sometimes misunderstanding, sometimes rejection. He did it with great grace. But I think one lasting thing I just would want to point out, I can remember on the platform of Spring Harvest over on the big top platform, and I was privileged to be there for many years. And those were the days when you sat on the platform, and you looked like the presiding matron and nurses at a hospital annual Christmas ball. I'd be sitting next to Peter, and whoever the speaker was that night would come to the end of their message. And on so many occasions, if I was responsible for the conclusion of the service, Peter would turn to me and he would just say two words. He'd say, "So what? So what?" In doing that, he wasn't being disparaging at all about the preacher, the speaker. He was really saying, so what now? What can we do now to earth what we have just heard and get that rooted into the lives of all of us who have just heard this message from Scripture? So what? And I can't tell you how many times since I've sat in probably through 50,000 services and church gatherings over my years of ministry. So many times I've heard Peter's voice in my head and my heart saying, so what? And sometimes actually, without becoming unkind, to actually try and think, well, has this been useful? This 27-part sermon series on the gallbladders of Leviticus might have been really fascinating to around 11 people on planet Earth, but what difference did it actually make from Sunday morning to Monday morning? Peter was always about the so what. That's why Premier Christian Radio. That's why Premier Magazine. That's why Spring Harvest. And if I can just say this, Martin, that's why just yesterday in the church here in Colorado, Ruth Durnley was here, who heads up Stop the Traffic. Stop the Traffic is now globally impacting the scourge of human sex trafficking. And Ruth said to me, knowing that we were going to be chatting today, she said, I would not be here doing what I'm doing and making the impact that the organization is making with government, with law enforcement, with legislation, with prevention, as well as campaigning. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I hadn't met Peter Meadows, if I hadn't been a nanny to the children that Peter and Rosie had, if they hadn't taken me along to Spring Harvest, if Peter hadn't told me that I was doing the Bible reading in the big top the next day and my knees were shaking as a result, she said, I would not be doing what I'm doing today if it wasn't for dear Peter Meadows. Legacy, honestly, it just goes on and on and on. And above all of that was a loving family man and a great friend. And the combination of the impact made through ministry and the love and friendship shared through character. It's often been said, Martin, that which we build with our gift, we can destroy with our character. Peter did well until the end. And just a few weeks ago, I was with him in London. I had the opportunity to look him in the eye because we knew the end was coming. And I was able to look at him and say, Peter, thank you. And I love you. I don't just appreciate you. I love you. My life will always be marked for the good because of this godly pioneer who did such amazing things.
For me, being in Christian radio since the mid to late 1990s, people must understand outside the UK, it was illegal. And Peter was one of the pioneers to change that, along with a couple of other people as well.
Yeah.
That's another thing that he did. Can I ask you how you would summarize Peter's life as a Christian and what he did in 5 words or less?
A preacher can't pay a bill in a restaurant in 5 words or less. But I would say bold, faith-filled, faithful. That's 4 words. And I use this word thoughtfully and advisedly. It might be misunderstood. But I'm going to say, because of the combination of those 4 words, beautiful. A beautiful man. I'm grateful for him.
Wow. I would have let you have faith-filled as a hyphenated word, actually. Steve, what would you like to add in this tribute to Peter?
Shortly before Peter died, he obviously was asked by his family to put together a life story for the sake of almost his legacy to the family. And he says in this book, which is called My Life, when two of your children and two of your grandchildren all give you a please tell us your story book for Christmas, they deserve to be treated seriously. And I have. And he's actually produced this book before he died. So within the credits of the book, he thanks Kristen, Zana, Joel, Zach and Aaron for almost pushing him into putting it down in writing. It is a lovely testimony to his life, and I'm sure he's much loved by his family.
Well, talking of which, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Zana Stewart, Peter and Rosie's daughter. Zana, what was it like for you growing up with this pioneer who we've been discussing, but it just happened to be your dad? What do you remember those times?
Oh, my daddy. To me, he was always dad, but a superhero dad. So I remember him at Spring Harvest walking around and being so proud of like, this is my daddy. And I get to call him dad. But for him, it was always just, he was dad. You know, so for me, I was always like, he's so cool. And he's like, no, I'm just your dad. It just always used to stand out to me that it was never about him being anything else other than being dad to me. And that was always the way he was. It was never about him. It was always about Jesus.
That is very interesting. What do you remember of those times then?
Oh, well, I just remember him showing up, being there alongside me, being like a superhero, just a superhero. And I guess that's, in some ways, it reflects how God is with us, that God is so great and inspiring, but yet also close, present and personal. And that sounds really kind of wordy, but that was what it was like to be with my dad. He was a superhero, someone I was so close to, but yeah, I looked up to so much, but I could get close to.
Yeah. Because we've been talking on the podcast for your dad about how for a visionary often comes frustration. So what was it like when he would come home, most probably having had a really bad business meeting or whatever, and he comes through the doors and then all of a sudden he's going to be dad? What do you remember about any frustration that he might have been carrying?
My mum was a super mum too. Remember, I'm the youngest of 5 and they're a lot older than me. What I remember, they were well rehearsed in kind of how to deal with coming home from work, stresses and how bad the day was. So I got a great dad that was really present because they were well rehearsed in how that all kind of that worked. But he, you know, I remember him sitting there with the newspapers, with his feet up on the table. But he, you know, but also he worked hard. He worked really, really hard. He did. They did in those days. I'm not saying men don't work hard now, but it was full on. It was full on. And having 5 kids, he would tuck me up in bed. He would read bedtime stories. It was different for me. I was the girl. The boys wanted to play football with him, but he would find a way to connect with me. And he did. He did. But I would say that it was only since my mum died about 2.5 years ago, the best thing from that was this beautiful relationship I had with my dad.
Tell us more then, please.
Well, it would always be that very stereotypical relationship with my dad that I would phone up, he would answer and he would say straight away, I'll go and get mum. And I was very, very close to my mum, and she sadly died 2.5 years before my dad. So when my mum died, I was there to pick up my dad, not out of duty, although there is obviously that, but it was out of, I want to look after my dad. And from that, we just had the most beautiful, beautiful relationship that I don't even think about the years before that, because that was so special. And we would have a tradition every 6 months, we would go and have a pedicure together, which is, if you can imagine that. We would look after each other. I would phone him 3 times a day. We went to Spain a lot. He'd come on family holidays. And again, just present, super present. He was helping me even when he was really poorly, helping me setting up my new business venture. He was very excited about that. He was an encourager and a cheerleader.
What one takeaway will you have to say, yes, that's the legacy that he's given me?
My legacy would be that he lived with kindness, integrity, and was consistent. The way that he was so consistent, you never got him in a bad mood. You totally knew what you were getting. There were no eggshells. He was consistently, beautifully kind and gentle and respectful, but yet had this authority without me being scared of him. I think that's the legacy, I hope.
And what do you see in yourself that you think, oh, that's my dad. That's what I've got from him?
Oh, it might make me a bit emotional. It will be that I show up for my kids because he showed me how to show up for me. He was my cheerleader at school. I had a tough time at school. Secondary school was not a great place for me. And he supported me and really fought my corner, not in a way that a parent has to, but the way that he knew that that was what love was advocating for your child. So that's what he's put in me, is that you show up for your kids, you're there for your kids, you support them and you love them.
That's a wonderful answer. Finally, Sanna, we've heard a lot about what he was like on the stage and what he was like in meetings. So we know about his public faith, but what about his personal faith? What can you share on that?
One thing I can share with you is that his last few kind of moments, last few days of being with us here, is that I was with him as he was gently fading. And I remember saying to him clearly, going, you know, it's okay. He goes, I know it's okay. I've got to save you. And he was totally unwavered in his confidence that where he was going. That was not a doubt in his mind. Even the hospice staff said that, you know, he's a case study of seeing how peaceful you can be when you have a faith. And I just, you know, gently reassured him, saying, Jesus is waiting. And he was quite frail at this time. And he was quite stern with me. And he was like, no, Sanna, he's not waiting. He's coming for me. And he was able to explain that Jesus wasn't waiting for him, but Jesus was coming for him. This is a relationship where he comes after us. He chases after us. It's in his timing. And I think when we think waiting is as if Jesus doesn't really know when he's coming, Jesus was all over it. And he was so confident of that. And that was so kind of profound and reassuring for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. As we rapidly approach the end of this tribute to Peter, what did this pioneer do to relax, either with or without his beloved wife Rosie and family? To share more and to leave us with a parting thought is his close friend, author, broadcaster, and another pioneer in so many areas of life, the Reverend Steve Chalk. Over to you, good sir.
Well, what can I say about Pete? He has been my friend for more than 40 years. And as they say, grief is the price we pay for love. And that's definitely true. I can honestly tell you, Pete's left a gaping hole in my life because over these last years, actually these last 20 years or so, we really have walked together through all sorts of things. And somebody said to me recently, though death might end a life, it doesn't end a relationship. And I feel that things I learned from Pete about communication, about writing, about planning, etc., all of those things continue to live on for me. I first met Pete in a very strange way because years and years ago, when Spring Harvest had only been going a year or two, it was run by Pete, whose idea it was, which he then shared with a guy called Clive Calver and others, and they all came together. And then they asked me to be involved. And I'd done little bits of television then, and I met Clive Calver, Pete Meadows, and Dave Pope, who were kind of like the Trinity running this thing in those days. And I had a meeting with them and they said, look, we'd like you to do some TV. There was a TV at Prestatyn and played into all the chalets, pre-digital, it's prehistoric, basically. Pete stressed on me, and you've got to make us human. You've really got to make us human. Let people know we're just ordinary, mortal flesh and blood. We're not great, exalted leaders. So on the actual day, back to back, who were coming in a big van with all their drama props, got stuck in a giant traffic jam. And so it was only me doing this thing, but there's no videos to show you. You can't switch to this cartoon or that thing. It was just me going on hour after hour after hour, and they couldn't cut away to anything. We actually had one video I could play. It was U2, and it was New Year's Day. Well, how many times can you play that? You can't play. And now another hit. Oh, yes. It's U2, New Year's Day.
From the War album.
Yeah, exactly. So I was going through this stuff, but back to back weren't arriving. And then U2 were playing, and I thought, I know what to do. They said, bring them down to earth, make them appear human, make fun, etc. When it came back to me, I held up the programme, which had Clive and Pete and Dave Pope's pictures in the front. So I said, so families, you're arriving. I've told you what's going on. I've told you about tonight. I've told you everything that's going to be spectacular through this week. But here's something for the children to do. You've all got a program like this with these three guys. They are our leaders, but they're ordinary human beings. They're humble people who want to serve you. What I'd like you to do is, if you look at them, Pete's a great bloke. Why don't you get your kids to design a new hairstyle for him and draw it on? I was only trying to make Pete human. He was chilled out and fine about it. In actual fact, Rosemary genuinely became just one of my best friends over the year, along with Pete. We went on holiday with them, all sorts of things. Just a fantastic couple. The thing that I owe Pete most for is this. I don't know if this is widely known. Pete Meadows brought Tony Campolo to this country. Pete and Tony played such a huge part in my life, and Tony became a mentor to me, and I traveled around the world and spoke at all sorts of things with Tony. Pete had got a tape of this guy called Tony Campolo. He decided to play it, and he was driving up a motorway one day, and he put this cassette tape in, and he began playing this thing. And he said he had never heard anything like it in his life, so overwhelmed by it that he had to pull in because he just couldn't drive. And he listened to this thing. And he booked Tony Campolo to come to Spring Harvest the next year, where I got to meet Tony. Tony became such an extraordinary friend to me. And I always said to Pete, I would have never met Tony had you not listened to that tape. You took chances. Tony blew your mind. Tony blew my mind, but it's down to you. And what Oasis is has been much built around that. Pete's view of his faith and his honesty was extraordinary. It was only a few days before he died, actually, and I went to visit Pete with Stuart Pascal. The three of us used to play golf together in Spain and here and go out for meals together all the time. So Stu and I went to visit Pete in hospice, and Pete had known for a long time he was dying, and he was very weak, and he was completely chilled about this. That was extraordinary about Pete. I have never come across anyone, Christian or non-Christian, who was that at peace. When we saw him, he was characteristically honest. He was as open as ever, and he was even chilled, relaxed about the fact that his life was ebbing to an end on this earth. And he said, Steve, I've been thinking about that new project you've been telling me about, and I've got some ideas. And he gave me some ideas, and he gave me a contact, and he showed me a card out of his wallet of someone, gave me their phone number. He said, chase those down. And do you know, Martin, all of them are good. And I'm already implementing them. I'm already implementing his ideas. That is who Pete was.
And he contacted me 2 weeks before Christmas to say, right, I'm giving a nudge to a person in America for Off-Grid Christianity. And the chap wrote back to me, said, when you get a nudge from Peter, you do something. I did not know how ill he was. And he wrote to me 2 weeks before Christmas. It was an amazing email.
He'd say to Stu and I, because we used to go in a particular pub, we used to go and sit there every month or so on a Friday night and have a meal together. We all sat at the same table. In fact, last Friday, Stuart and I went back there just to talk about Pete together. But we used to sit at the same table, and Pete used to say, I love talking with you. He said, because we can talk about Chelsea. Stuart's a Man United supporter. I'm a Palace supporter. So we talk about football. We talk about all sorts of stuff. And he said, I love it talking to you because you don't even ask me how I am. Of course, we cared about who he was, how he was, but he loved having a conversation that wasn't about what's the diagnosis today, Pete? How's it going? What's your tablet regime like? All that kind of thing. Oh, you've lost a bit of weight. We just sit there and laugh about all sorts of stuff together. It's brilliant.
In closing, first of all, I'd love to just give my thanks to all the contributors who've made time available, especially in such short notice. Particular thanks as well to Zana for all her assistance behind the scenes. So to close, from me, a Bristol City fan, to you, Steve, a Crystal Palace fan, what 5 words would you use as a legacy for Peter, a Chelsea fan? And I'll even accept hyphenated words if that's all right.
Well, I think if you could make this hyphenated, he was explosively creative. He was unreservedly frank. I can just tell it you the way it was. He was brave. He was courageous. He was belligerent, really belligerent. And I think irrepressibly hopeful. That's too many words, isn't it?
No, it's all one word. It's the longest word in the dictionary now.
He really was. He was hopeful. He was the definition of hope. He was the definition of hope. Hope is fierce, and Pete was fierce.
Steve Chalk, as always, thank you so much for what you shared, and hopefully everyone would have enjoyed this tribute to Peter Meadows, who died sadly in January this year. Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
So when the time came for myself to hand over responsibility, part of me was very pleased. I would have to say this, and this doesn't apply to Spring Harvest. I think sometimes the way the Christian organizations or even the church, the way they manage change is appalling. They tend to kick people out rather than honor them, but remove them from executive responsibility. And in all of the advice I find myself now giving to organizations that are wanting to move on and change, I always try to encourage them not to have a night of the long knives, but to actually honor the foundational people, even though it's time for them to be encouraged to move on. There's a way of doing it. Sadly, many Christian organizations and churches haven't got a clue how to do that properly.
So please join me next week with our special guest, Dave Pope, the gentleman who really affected my life in the mid-1980s with his Dirty Hands tour. Without that, would I be here today doing these podcasts? Great privilege to have him on, and wow, does he share some great stuff. Until then, cheerio.